I am Natalie, 33 years old, and my billionaire father chose my wedding reception to publicly destroy me. He stood before 300 of the wealthiest people in the country, seized the microphone, and declared that I was officially cut off from the family fortune. Seconds later, my mother walked up and physically ripped the antique diamond tiara from my hair. My flashy brother-in-law tossed a single crumpled $100 bill at my new husband's feet, laughing while he told us to take an Uber back to the slums. They thought they had entirely ruined my life. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they had absolutely no idea the quiet, unassuming man I had just married was the exact predator who would soon swallow their entire corporate empire whole. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who desperately underestimated your worth. The evening began flawlessly at one of the most exclusive country clubs in the state. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over tables draped in imported silk. Waiters in crisp uniforms carried silver trays of champagne, and the string quartet played softly in the background. I was a crisis management public relations director. I spent my days fixing the catastrophic mistakes of wealthy executives controlling narratives and putting out fires. I thought I had everything under control. Beside me sat Leo, my husband of exactly 4 hours. He was 34 years old, wearing a rented tuxedo that fit him perfectly, holding my hand under the table. To my family, Leo was just a low-level data analyst who drove a beat-up 10-year-old Honda. They despised him because he did not come from old money. He did not wear designer watches, and he completely ignored their attempts to intimidate him. The tension had been building since that morning. My father, Richard Pierce, the CEO of Pierce Luxury Estates, had cornered me in the bridal suite. He shoved a 50-page post-nuptial agreement into my hands. It was a vile, humiliating document designed to strip Leo of his dignity, explicitly labeling him as a financial liability and ensuring he would be left with absolutely nothing, not even basic respect, if our marriage failed. It was not about protecting assets. It was about establishing dominance. I looked my father in the eye, tore the document in half, and dropped it into the wastebasket. I told him my marriage was not a corporate merger. I thought that was the end of it, assuming his obsession with public image would keep him in check for the rest of the day. I severely underestimated his need for absolute control. The best man was halfway through a light-hearted speech when the screech of audio feedback pierced the elegant dining room. Everyone winced, turning their attention to the head table. My father had marched across the room and forcefully snatched the microphone directly out of the best man's hand. The music stopped abruptly. The chatter died down. 300 pairs of eyes locked onto Richard Pierce. He stood there, his face flushed with rage, adjusting his expensive tailored suit jacket. "I want to make an announcement," my father said, his voice booming through the speakers, echoing off the high ceilings. A wedding is supposed to be the merging of two great families, a celebration of legacy. But today, my eldest daughter has decided to spit on the legacy I built with my bare hands. I felt the blood drain from my face. Leo squeezed my hand, his thumb rubbing soothingly over my knuckles. He did not look panicked. He just watched my father with a calm, unreadable expression. My father pointed a shaking finger directly at me. Natalie was given a choice this morning: protect the Pierce family empire or throw her life away on a man who brings absolutely zero value to this table. She chose the latter, so let everyone here be a witness. As of this exact second, Natalie is completely cut out of my will. Her trust fund is dissolved. She will not receive a single dime of the Pierce fortune. The silence in the room was deafening. You could hear a pin drop. Guests stared at their plates, too uncomfortable to move. I sat frozen, my heart pounding so hard it physically hurt my chest. I had spent my entire life trying to be the perfect daughter, fixing their public relations disasters, protecting the family name, and here he was burning it all to the ground, just because he could not control my choice in a husband. Before I could even process the shock, my mother, Patricia, stepped up to the table. She had always been obsessed with status, constantly reminding me that I needed to act like a true socialite. She did not say a word to me. Instead, she reached out and aggressively yanked the diamond tiara right off my head. The sharp metal pins pulled at my scalp, tearing out several strands of my carefully styled hair. I gasped in pain, bringing my hands to my ruined veil. "This belongs to the estate," my mother said coldly, holding the sparkling jewelry against her chest. "This is for true Pierce women only. You clearly do not belong in that category anymore." My younger sister Amanda sat at the next table, sipping her champagne, with a smirk of absolute satisfaction. She was 30 years old, the undisputed golden child, heavily spoiled, and completely dependent on my parents' wealth. Next to her sat her husband, Jamal. He was an African-American man, 32 years old, a flashy, arrogant stockbroker who wore suits that cost more than my first car. He was my parents' favorite simply because he played their game, constantly bragging about being a Wall Street prodigy and driving a ridiculous sports car. Jamal stood up, laughing loudly, breaking the heavy silence in the room. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his designer money clip, and extracted a crisp $100 bill. He casually walked over to our table, crumpled the bill in his hand, and tossed it right at Leo. It hit my husband's chest and fluttered down to the pristine white floor. "Here you go, data boy." Jamal sneered, his voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "Call an Uber and take your new wife back to whatever slums you came from. The Pierce Bank is officially closed for business." A few of my parents' wealthy friends actually chuckled. The humiliation washed over me like a suffocating wave of heat. I was shaking, tears of pure anger and embarrassment stinging the corners of my eyes. I prepared myself to stand up, to scream, to defend the man I loved against these vile people. But Leo moved first. He did not yell. He did not lose his temper. He simply stood up from his chair, completely ignoring Jamal's arrogant grin. Leo took one step forward and calmly placed his polished dress shoe directly on top of the crumpled $100 bill, pinning it to the floor. He did not even look at the money. He turned to me, wrapping his strong arms around my shoulders, shielding me from the staring crowd. He kissed the top of my head, right where my mother had torn the tiara away, and pulled me close. He looked me in the eyes, his own gaze sharp, steady, and entirely fearless. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile, completely unbothered by the billionaires and socialites watching us. "We do not need it," Leo whispered quietly, but with a terrifying certainty that sent a shiver down my spine. "We do not need a single thing from them." We walked out of that country club with our heads held high, leaving my entire family to stew in their own manufactured drama. We did not look back. We spent the next 2 weeks on a quiet, modest honeymoon in a rented cabin off the coast of Maine. There were no five-star resorts or private jets, just early morning hikes, crackling fires, and the deep, unwavering comfort of being with a man who actually valued me as a human being. I intentionally kept my phone turned off. I wanted to exist in a bubble of peace before facing the inevitable fallout of my father's bruised ego. I assumed Richard Pierce would throw a tantrum, cut my access to the family trust, and freeze my corporate expense accounts. I was fully prepared for that. I was a highly paid public relations director, and I had my own income. I did not care about his money. But I severely underestimated how far a narcissistic billionaire would go to punish a daughter who refused to obey his commands. The reality check hit us the moment we returned to Portland. We stopped at a local grocery store to pick up some basics for our apartment. When I handed the cashier my personal debit card, the machine beeped a loud, obnoxious decline. I frowned, apologizing to the cashier, and handed over my primary credit card. Declined. I pulled out a backup card. Declined again. Panic flared in my chest. I stepped out of the checkout line and immediately called my bank. The customer service representative sounded incredibly nervous when she pulled up my file. She informed me that every single account associated with my Social Security number had been frozen due to a pending legal review initiated by the primary account guarantor, my father. He had not just cut off my trust fund. He had deployed his team of ruthless corporate lawyers to freeze my personal checking accounts, citing a fabricated contractual dispute over funds he had gifted me a decade ago. I was standing in the middle of a grocery store aisle with absolutely zero access to my own hard-earned cash. Leo calmly paid for our groceries with his debit card, ushered me into his beat-up Honda, and told me we would figure it out. I assured him everything would be fine. I still had a lucrative career. I told him I would simply route my next paycheck to a brand new independent bank account and sever the final financial ties with my family. I went to sleep that night feeling stressed but completely capable of handling the situation. The true depth of my father's cruelty became apparent at 8 o'clock the next morning. I walked into the sleek, glass-walled lobby of the elite crisis management firm, where I had worked tirelessly for 6 years. I expected to face a mountain of emails after my honeymoon. Instead, I walked into my corner office and found 2 security guards standing next to my desk. Every single item I had personally owned, my framed degrees, my client files, my coffee mug was already packed into 3 brown cardboard boxes. My boss, the managing partner of the firm, stood by the window looking physically ill. He could barely meet my eyes as he handed me a severely diminished severance package. I demanded to know what was going on. I was their top-performing director. I had just saved a major airline from a massive public relations disaster right before my wedding. The managing partner ran a shaking hand over his face and confessed the truth. My father had called him personally. Richard Pierce did not just threaten to pull his massive real estate accounts from our agency. He had called 5 of his closest billionaire associates and convinced them to threaten the agency as well. They delivered a unified ultimatum. The agency either fired me immediately or they would pull tens of millions of dollars in retainer contracts by noon. My boss apologized profusely, saying he simply could not afford to lose half the firm's revenue over a family dispute. He begged me to understand that it was strictly business. I was escorted out of the building like a criminal carrying a cardboard box full of desk supplies, my career completely decimated by the petty vengeance of a man who could not handle hearing the word no. I stood on the bustling downtown sidewalk, the cold wind biting at my cheeks. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a new text message from my younger sister, Amanda. I opened the message. It was short, vicious, and dripping with her trademark arrogance. Dad says you can have your job back the second you divorce the loser and apologize to the family. Enjoy the slums. They expected me to break. They wanted me to drop to my knees, cry hysterically on the sidewalk, and call my father begging for mercy. They assumed that stripping away my financial independence and my professional identity would leave me as a helpless shell of a woman. They were dead wrong. I did not shed a single tear. I felt a cold, sharp wave of absolute clarity wash over me. I immediately deleted Amanda's hateful message, blocked her number, and carried my boxes to a nearby coffee shop. Leo was waiting for me there. He had insisted on driving me to work that morning and had decided to stay close by working on his laptop. When he saw me walk through the door carrying my packed office, his jaw tightened. He immediately stood up, took the heavy boxes from my arms, and guided me to a quiet booth in the back. I sat across from him, opened my laptop, and started furiously typing. Leo asked me what had happened. I told him exactly what my father had done, how Richard had blackmailed my firm, and how Amanda had texted me the insulting ultimatum. I did not pause to complain or seek pity. I immediately started drafting a business plan. I told Leo that if my father wanted to play corporate warfare, I would simply build my own independent public relations consultancy from the ground up. I already had the skills, the industry knowledge, and the drive. I began pulling up state registry forms to file for a new limited liability company. I started listing potential clients who operated completely outside of my father's sphere of influence. I was entirely laser-focused on rebuilding my empire on my own terms. Leo sat across the table watching me work. His dark eyes tracked my rapid movements across the keyboard. He did not offer empty platitudes or tell me everything was going to be all right. He simply watched the fierce determination radiating from my posture, a quiet look of profound respect settling over his features. After a few minutes, he reached across the table, gently touched my hand to pause my typing, and smiled. He told me he was going to step outside for a quick moment to get us some fresh air and make a brief call regarding his data analytics job. I nodded absently, diving right back into my business registration forms. I was so consumed with mapping out my survival strategy that I did not notice the dangerous, predatory shift in my husband's demeanor as he walked out the door. Leo stepped out onto the busy sidewalk, the cheerful facade of a low-level IT worker dropping instantly. He pulled a highly encrypted custom-built smartphone from his jacket pocket. He dialed a direct unlisted number that bypassed every secretary and connected straight to the executive floor of a private equity stronghold in Manhattan. His voice was no longer warm or gentle. It was cold, sharp, and brutally authoritative. Initiate a full financial sweep on Pierce Luxury Estates. Leo commanded, his eyes locked on the coffee shop window where I was furiously typing. Dig into their corporate loans, their leveraged assets, and their shadow debts. Leave no stone unturned. I want to know exactly who they owe, and I want to know every single penny they bleed. We did not have the luxury of time to sit in that coffee shop and mourn the loss of my career. By the time we returned to the sprawling 3,000-square-foot downtown loft we had called home, the eviction notice was already taped to the heavy oak door. The property was technically owned by Pierce Luxury Estates, a corporate perk my father had dangled over my head for years to ensure my absolute loyalty. We were given exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises before building security would lock us out and confiscate our belongings. We spent the entire night packing our lives into cardboard boxes and heavy-duty trash bags. I left behind the custom Italian leather sofas, the expensive artwork, and every single item purchased with my father's money. I only took what truly belonged to me and Leo. With my bank accounts completely frozen by my father's legal team, we had to rely on the modest savings Leo kept in an unassuming local credit union. We found a small, cramped one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. The building smelled faintly of bleach and old cooking oil. The floors squeaked loudly under our feet, and the view from our single living room window overlooked a noisy neon-lit convenience store. It was a massive downgrade from a luxury penthouse, but as we stacked our boxes in the tiny living space, I felt a strange sense of ownership. This cinder-block square was ours. Nobody could hold it over our heads. We were exhausted, sweating, and covered in dust. I was in the middle of wrestling a heavy box of books onto the kitchen counter when a deafening, obnoxious engine roar rattled the thin glass of our window. I peered through the blinds and felt a familiar surge of intense irritation. A pristine, brand-new silver Aston Martin was parked illegally across two spaces in front of our building. The gull-wing doors opened, and out stepped my younger sister Amanda, wearing a pristine white cashmere coat that cost more than a year of our current rent. Beside her was Jamal, adjusting his oversized designer sunglasses and smoothing the lapels of his custom-tailored suit. They walked up the cracked concrete steps, dodging a stray puddle, looking around with exaggerated expressions of absolute disgust. Minutes later, there was a sharp, rapid knocking at our door. I pulled it open to find Amanda holding a single, pitiful, potted succulent. She pushed her way inside without waiting for an invitation. Her nose wrinkled in visible disdain as she surveyed the cramped quarters. "We came to help the newlyweds," Amanda announced, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Mom was just so worried you two were living in absolute squalor." I see her concerns were completely justified. Jamal followed her inside, casually tossing his car keys onto our small dining table. He looked at the cheap linoleum floor and chuckled, shaking his head slowly. "This place is a real step down for a Pierce woman," Jamal said, leaning against the counter as if he owned the room. "Your dad really meant business when he cut the cord. You should have just signed that post-nuptial agreement, Natalie. Now look at you packing boxes in a shoebox." I glared at him, telling them both they could leave their fake pity at the door and get out of my home immediately. Amanda just sighed, pretending to be the highly concerned younger sister. "We are not here to fight," she said, crossing her arms. "Jamal actually has a business proposition for Leo. A lifeline if you are smart enough to take it." Jamal puffed out his chest, radiating unearned arrogance. "Your father just promoted me?" Jamal bragged, a smug grin spreading across his face. He appointed me to manage the Pierce Family Reserve Fund. $150 million, all under my direct control. I am the youngest asset manager in the company's history. I have got my own executive team now, but my tech department is lacking. I need an IT assistant to fix my printers, organize my spreadsheets, and handle the basic technical support. It pays minimum wage, but it is steady work for a low-level data entry guy like you. Jamal looked directly at Leo, holding out a glossy gold-embossed business card. Just take the job right now, Leo. It will definitely keep the lights on in this miserable little shack. I was about to unleash a torrent of absolute anger, ready to throw them both back out into the street. But Leo placed a gentle hand on my waist. He stepped forward, looking Jamal straight in the eye with a perfectly polite, entirely unbothered smile. I appreciate the generous offer, Jamal, Leo said smoothly, his voice devoid of any insult. But I prefer to keep my current data projects. Besides, managing $150 million sounds like an incredible amount of pressure. I am sure you have everything securely tied up in top-tier investments to protect Richard's capital. Jamal laughed loudly, eager to show off his supposed financial genius to a man he considered far beneath him. Oh yes, absolutely. I just moved $50 million into Vanguard Horizon Offshore. It is a highly exclusive, private hedge fund located overseas. You need a $10 million minimum just to get them on the phone. Highly sophisticated stuff, totally out of your league. Leo nodded slowly, his polite smile never faltering for a single second. Vanguard Horizon Offshore. Leo repeated, letting the words hang in the air. It sounds very sophisticated indeed. Jamal smirked, grabbed Amanda by the arm, and walked out the door, laughing all the way to his Aston Martin. They thought they had secured the ultimate victory. They did not notice the icy, predatory calculation in Leo's dark eyes. He had just been handed the exact name of the shadow fund, and the financial slaughter was about to begin right now. The very next morning, I woke up before the sun even crested the horizon. I sat at our wobbly kitchen table with a cup of cheap instant coffee and opened my laptop, determined to build my new public relations consultancy. I had a master list of over 100 industry contacts. These were executives I had personally shielded from media disasters, brand managers I had elevated to global recognition, and corporate presidents who owed their spotless reputations entirely to my crisis management skills. I was confident that at least a few of them would jump at the chance to retain my services, directly bypassing the exorbitant fees of my former agency. I started making calls, sending tailored pitch emails, and requesting brief meetings. By the end of the third day, the deafening silence was absolute. Every single door was forcefully slammed in my face. Phone calls went straight to voicemail. Emails were ignored or met with stiff automated responses from junior assistants stating that their companies were moving in a different direction. People who used to send me lavish holiday baskets and beg for my advice suddenly treated me like an invisible disease. I knew my father wielded immense corporate influence, but Richard Pierce did not have the power to black out the entire eastern seaboard of independent tech startups and boutique firms. Something else was happening. A toxic, fast-moving poison was actively destroying my professional name behind closed doors. I finally got my answer on a rainy Thursday afternoon. A former junior associate named Emma, who used to work under my direct supervision, agreed to meet me for a quick coffee in a discreet neighborhood far from the financial district. She looked incredibly nervous, constantly checking her surroundings, as if interacting with me was a fireable offense. She slid into the booth across from me and refused to even order a drink. She leaned in and dropped a bombshell that made my blood run entirely cold. The blackout had nothing to do with my father's business threats. It was my mother and Amanda. Emma revealed that Patricia and my younger sister had spent the entire week hosting exclusive luncheons at the most elite country clubs in the city. They were not just playing the role of disappointed family members. They were actively executing a vicious, coordinated smear campaign to annihilate my credibility. Emma told me the exact lies they were spreading. Patricia was telling every influential socialite board member and corporate spouse that my new husband Leo was a dangerous con artist. She claimed Leo was an identity thief, currently under an active high-level FBI investigation for defrauding multiple vulnerable women. Worse, Amanda was telling people that I had been completely brainwashed by him. My sister was spreading rumors that I had lost my mind, that I was secretly liquidating all my remaining assets, and that any money paid to my new PR firm would directly fund a criminal enterprise. They were terrifying my entire network, painting me as a massive legal and public relations liability. My own family was treating me like a radioactive threat, ensuring I would starve financially until I had absolutely no choice but to crawl back to their mansion and beg for forgiveness. A burning righteous anger ignited in my chest. I thanked Emma for her honesty, paid for the coffee, and marched straight back to my car. I was not going to sit in my cramped apartment and let my mother assassinate my character with country club gossip. I knew exactly where Patricia was that evening. She was the guest of honor and lead chairwoman at the annual Harbor Charity Gala, a highly publicized event held at the city's most opulent downtown ballroom. I drove home, changed into my sharpest, most intimidating black power suit, and drove straight to the venue. I bypassed the main entrance, used my knowledge of event management to slip past the busy security guards at the service doors, and walked directly into the grand ballroom. The space was dripping in excessive wealth, filled with towering floral arrangements, crystal chandeliers, and hundreds of the city's most powerful elites. I spotted my mother immediately. Patricia was standing in the VIP lounge section, holding a flute of expensive champagne, surrounded by a circle of wealthy, sycophantic wives. I walked right up to her circle. The women fell dead silent as they saw me approach. Patricia lowered her champagne glass, her perfectly manicured face tightening into a mask of pure ice. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with enough authority that the surrounding tables turned to listen. I looked my mother dead in the eye and told her that her pathetic lies were going to end tonight. I demanded she stop spreading malicious, defamatory rumors about my husband to her bored, wealthy friends just because she was losing her grip on my life. Patricia did not flinch. She simply handed her champagne flute to a passing waiter, stepped slightly forward, and looked at me as if I were a stain on her expensive shoes. She did not bother to deny the rumors. Instead, she tilted her chin upward, ensuring her wealthy audience could hear every single word of her cruel response. "Society requires a bloodline, Natalie," my mother said, her voice dripping with absolute disdain. "You chose to mix yours with dirt. You threw away your prestige for a nobody, and now you will face the reality of the gutter you chose to live in. You are not a Pierce anymore. You are a cautionary tale." She told me I would be blacklisted from every legitimate business in the city, that I would go bankrupt, and that my so-called marriage would crumble the moment the money dried up. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me, feeling a profound wave of disgust. I did not yell. I simply told her that she would deeply regret picking this fight, turned on my heel, and walked out of the ballroom with my head held high. Despite my outward display of strength, the drive back to our tiny apartment was crushing. The reality of the blacklist was suffocating. I had bills to pay, a business registry to fund, and absolutely zero clients. I walked up the squeaky stairs to our unit, feeling completely drained. I sat down at my laptop on the kitchen counter, preparing myself to look at my empty business bank account. I needed to see exactly how many days we had left before we missed our first rent payment. I logged into the secure banking portal. The screen loaded. I blinked, rubbing my tired eyes, assuming the glare from the screen was playing tricks on my vision. I hit the refresh button on the keyboard. The numbers on the screen remained unchanged. A massive incoming wire transfer had just cleared. The transaction details were hidden behind a highly secure corporate privacy wall, listing the sender only as an anonymous subsidiary of an international private equity group. The deposit was for a staggering $500,000. It was coded as an absolute non-refundable retainer fee for immediate public relations services. I sat there completely paralyzed, my mouth slightly open, staring at $500,000 sitting comfortably in my brand new business checking account. My newly minted PR firm was not just saved, it was instantly transformed into a highly capitalized agency. I could not comprehend what was happening. I was entirely baffled, trying to figure out which former client had defied my father to send this level of financial backing. Leo walked into the kitchen carrying 2 steaming cups of cheap corner store coffee. He set one down next to my laptop. He leaned over my shoulder, his eyes casually scanning the screen, showing the $500,000 balance. He took a slow sip of his coffee. He did not ask any questions. He did not look surprised. He just looked at the massive deposit, gave me a quiet, incredibly knowing smile, and kissed my cheek. I stared at the $500,000 sitting in my account, the weight of the past few weeks suddenly lifting off my shoulders. I did not know who this anonymous investor was, but their timing was immaculate. I decided right then and there that we were going to celebrate. I grabbed my coat and told Leo I was taking him out for a proper dinner. We drove to a high-end steakhouse downtown, a place we used to frequent back when I still had my corporate expense account. Tonight I was paying with my own newly minted business card. The atmosphere inside the restaurant was dimly lit and sophisticated, filled with the low hum of wealthy patrons making discreet deals over premium cuts of beef. We were seated at a quiet booth near the back, enjoying our first moment of genuine relaxation in what felt like an eternity. We were halfway through our main course when a loud, obnoxious laugh shattered the elegant ambiance of the dining room. I stiffened, recognizing that grating sound immediately. I looked up and saw Jamal striding through the restaurant with Amanda clinging tightly to his arm. He was wearing an aggressively tailored velvet dinner jacket, loudly demanding the hostess seat them at the best table in the house. As they walked past our section, Amanda stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes widened as she took in my sharp blazer and the expensive bottle of wine resting on our table. She immediately tapped Jamal on the shoulder and pointed in our direction. Jamal turned his head, a malicious grin spreading across his face. He changed his trajectory and marched directly over to our booth, making sure to draw the attention of the surrounding tables. "Well, well, well," Jamal announced, his voice booming uncomfortably loud. "I guess the unemployment check's finally cleared. What are you two doing in a place like this? Did you have to pawn your wedding rings just to afford the appetizers?" I placed my fork down very slowly, maintaining my composure. I told Jamal we were having a private dinner and politely asked him to leave us alone. Amanda scoffed, crossing her arms over her designer dress. She loudly proclaimed that they were simply checking on their destitute relatives. Jamal snapped his fingers at our waiter, who hurried over looking incredibly tense. "Put their entire meal on my tab," Jamal instructed the waiter, waving his hand dismissively at our table. "In fact, box up a few extra steaks for them to take home. It looks like they are absolutely starving. I cannot have my wife's sister eating out of dumpsters. Consider it my weekly charity donation to the less fortunate." The surrounding patrons were openly staring now, whispering behind their menus. I felt a surge of familiar anger rising in my chest, but before I could retaliate, Jamal reached into the breast pocket of his velvet jacket. He pulled out a thick, ostentatious alligator skin wallet to retrieve his exclusive black corporate card. As he yanked the card out with an arrogant flourish, a folded piece of thermal receipt paper slipped loose from the leather folds. It fluttered quietly through the air and landed face down on the polished hardwood floor right next to Leo's chair. Jamal did not notice. He was too busy posing for the onlookers, thoroughly enjoying his moment of supreme financial dominance. Leo did not say a single word. He calmly pushed his chair back, leaned down, and picked up the piece of paper. As he lifted it, he unfolded it for a second. I watched Leo's dark eyes scan the printed text with terrifying speed. He absorbed the offshore routing numbers, the corporate entity names, and the massive transfer amounts printed on the banking receipt. It was a skill I had always admired, his ability to photographically capture raw data in an instant. Leo folded the paper back into a perfect square, stood up, and held it out to Jamal. His expression remained neutral, his polite smile firmly in place. "You dropped this, Jamal," Leo said softly. "You should be much more careful with your transaction records. Someone might get the wrong idea about where you keep the family money." Jamal snatched the receipt out of Leo's hand, his arrogant smile faltering as a flash of genuine panic crossed his eyes. He quickly shoved the paper into his pocket, threw his credit card at the waiter, and told Amanda they were leaving to find a restaurant with a better clientele. They stormed out, leaving our bill fully paid. I let out a heavy sigh, hating that they had managed to humiliate us again. Leo sat back down, picked up his wineglass, and took a slow sip. The polite smile was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating intensity. "We need to go home," Leo said quietly. "Right now." We abandoned our dinner, drove back to our cramped apartment in silence, and locked the door behind us. The moment we stepped inside, Leo shed his casual demeanor completely. He walked straight past our kitchen and sat down at the heavy metal desk where he kept his computer set up. I watched in silence as his fingers flew across the keyboard. He pulled up public filings, cross-referencing the exact routing digits he memorized from Jamal's receipt. After 20 minutes of typing, Leo stopped and faced me. "Your father put Jamal in charge of a $150 million reserve fund," Leo said, his voice deadly calm. "Jamal is not investing a single penny." I tracked the routing numbers. He is funneling massive chunks of the reserve into dummy corporations. He is covering up catastrophic margin calls and illegal gambling debts. He is bleeding your father's empire dry. Pierce Luxury Estates is weeks away from total insolvency, and your father has absolutely no idea his favorite son-in-law is robbing him blind. I stood frozen as I realized my family was about to lose everything. The sheer magnitude of the financial crimes echoed in my mind, but I forced myself to push those thoughts aside. My father had made his bed. He had chosen his golden son-in-law over his own blood. My only priority was protecting my husband and securing the future of my newly launched public relations agency. With the anonymous $500,000 retainer safely deposited, I spent the next 48 hours working relentlessly. I drafted press releases, organized crisis management strategies for my new client, and began building a formidable independent brand. I felt an incredible surge of momentum. I was finally breaking free from the suffocating grip of my former life. That fleeting sense of triumph was brutally crushed on Wednesday morning. A loud, aggressive knock echoed through our cramped apartment. I opened the door to find a man in a cheap gray suit, holding a thick stack of manila folders. He asked for my name, shoved the heavy documents into my chest, and walked away without another word. I carried the papers to the kitchen table, breaking the seal with trembling hands. The bold black letters across the top page made my blood run entirely cold. It was a massive multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit filed directly by the corporate legal team at my father's company. My father was suing me. He had orchestrated a completely fabricated legal attack, claiming I had stolen proprietary trade secrets, violated stringent non-compete clauses, and engaged in corporate espionage when I launched my independent agency. The allegations were absolutely absurd. I had never taken a single client or confidential document from his empire. But the truth did not matter in the face of his limitless financial resources. He had weaponized the legal system to utterly destroy me. The true horror of his strategy revealed itself on the second page. His high-powered attorneys had convinced a judge to issue an immediate temporary injunction against my business. The order mandated a total freeze on my newly minted corporate checking account, pending a preliminary hearing scheduled for this coming Friday. The $500,000 retainer I had just received was completely locked down. I could not touch a single penny. Worse, the lawsuit included a formal petition to the state licensing board. If I failed to mount a proper legal defense at the Friday hearing, the judge would grant a permanent injunction. My professional public relations license would be revoked forever. I would be legally barred from ever working in my industry again. Panic gripped my chest like a vice. I immediately called the best corporate defense attorney in the city, a ruthless litigator who despised my father's legal team. He reviewed the filings and agreed to take my case, assuring me he could easily get the injunction thrown out and the lawsuit dismissed. Then he delivered the fatal blow. He required a cash retainer of $100,000 paid in full by Thursday night to represent me in court the next morning. If the funds did not clear his trust account, he would not show up. I hung up the phone and stared blankly at the peeling paint on my apartment wall. My business account was frozen solid. My personal accounts were still locked by my father's previous legal maneuvers. Leo's modest credit union savings barely covered our monthly rent and groceries. We had absolutely no way to access $100,000 in clean external cash within 24 hours. My father had calculated this exact scenario. He knew the injunction would block my new funding. He knew I could not afford top-tier legal defense out of pocket. He did not just want me to fail. He wanted to publicly humiliate me, strip away my professional identity, and ensure I could never earn an independent living. By Thursday evening, the weight of the impending deadline crushed the last remaining fragments of my pride. The sun set outside our single window, casting long, dark shadows across the cheap linoleum floor. I sat on the edge of our mattress, staring at the blank screen of my cell phone. The reality of our situation was stark and unforgiving. If I lost my license tomorrow, Leo and I would be destitute. We would be drowning in legal debt for the rest of our lives, constantly hunted by corporate lawyers. There was only one way to stop the relentless assault. I had to surrender. I unlocked my phone and scrolled down to my father's contact name. A wave of profound nausea washed over me. I knew exactly what calling him would entail. I would have to beg for mercy. I would have to apologize for trying to build my own life. I would have to crawl back to his mansion, divorce the man I loved, and spend the rest of my days serving as a subservient prop in his manufactured family dynamic. It felt like a death sentence, but I believed I had no other choice. I took a shaky breath and prepared to press the call button. A warm, strong hand gently wrapped around my wrist. Leo stepped into the bedroom, his presence instantly grounding the chaotic spiral of my thoughts. He looked down at the phone in my hand, saw my father's name on the screen, and immediately understood what I was about to do. His dark eyes softened with profound empathy, but his jaw remained set with fierce determination. He reached out and carefully took the phone directly out of my hand. "You are never calling that man again," Leo said quietly, his voice vibrating with absolute certainty. "You are never begging anyone in that family for a single thing." I looked up at him, my vision blurring. "We need $100,000 tonight, Leo. If I do not pay the lawyer, I lose my license forever. My dad wins. He takes everything." Leo did not argue. He simply pulled his own encrypted smartphone from his pocket. He stood perfectly still in the dim light of our bedroom, his thumb moving across the glowing screen with practiced, deliberate speed. He opened a highly secure black interface banking application that I had never seen before. It required a facial recognition scan and a complex numerical passcode. Leo tapped the screen a few more times, entered the wire routing details for my defense attorney, and authorized a transfer. My cell phone chimed on the bedspread. I picked it up and opened my secure email. It was an automated receipt from the law firm. A certified, untraceable wire transfer for exactly $100,000 had just cleared their trust account. My legal defense was fully funded. My license was safe. The injunction would be destroyed in court tomorrow. I stood up, my legs trembling slightly. I stared at the confirmation email, then looked up at my husband in absolute shock. The man wearing a faded gray t-shirt and standing in a dilapidated apartment had just casually wired a fortune in liquid cash without breaking a single sweat. "Where did you get this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Leo slipped his phone back into his pocket. He looked at me, the corners of his mouth turning up into a cold, terrifyingly powerful smile. "I told you I analyzed data, Nat. I just analyzed very, very large data." While I stood in my cramped bedroom staring at my husband with a mixture of absolute awe and burning curiosity, a very different scene was unfolding 30 floors above the financial district. The gleaming glass-enclosed executive boardroom of Pierce Luxury Estates was supposed to be a fortress of untouchable wealth. That morning, it had transformed into a cage of escalating panic. The commercial real estate market had taken a sudden, violent downward plunge over the past 48 hours. Interest rates spiked, property valuations plummeted, and the heavily leveraged foundation of my father's corporate empire began to severely crack under the pressure. Richard Pierce stood at the head of his massive mahogany conference table, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the polished wood. His usually immaculate tailored suit jacket was thrown carelessly over a chair. The digital displays lining the walls flashed aggressive red numbers. 3 major commercial banks had just issued immediate margin calls on his most expensive construction projects. If he did not deposit $50 million into his corporate accounts by the end of the week, the banks would seize his flagship properties and trigger a catastrophic domino effect of cross defaults. His entire legacy was minutes away from total public exposure. He slammed his fist against the table, demanding his secretary summon his son-in-law immediately. Within minutes, the heavy double doors swung open and Jamal walked in. Jamal wore his usual custom-tailored Italian suit, exuding his carefully manufactured aura of Wall Street brilliance. He smiled confidently, completely unaware of the absolute financial bloodbath displayed on the screens behind my father. "Sit down, Jamal." Richard commanded, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. "We have a massive liquidity crisis. The banks are breathing down my neck and pulling our credit lines. I need you to initiate an emergency liquidation from the Family Reserve Fund right now. Wire $50 million directly into the primary corporate holding account before the market closes today." Jamal froze. The arrogant smile vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a sickly pale hue. He sat down heavily in one of the leather executive chairs. His heart pounded against his ribs with the force of a jackhammer. A cold sweat broke out across the back of his neck, soaking the expensive collar of his custom shirt. He could not wire $50 million to Richard. He could not wire $5 million. The $150 million reserve fund he had bragged about managing did not exist anymore. He had blown the vast majority of it on disastrous offshore margin trades, terrible cryptocurrency bets, and massive gambling debts funneled through dummy corporations. The money was completely gone, swallowed by the shadow market. Jamal swallowed hard, his mind racing through a million desperate scenarios. If he told Richard the truth, the billionaire would not just fire him. Richard would physically destroy him, hand him over to the federal authorities, and ensure he spent the next 20 years in a maximum security prison. Amanda would leave him instantly. He had to lie. He had to buy himself time to figure out a way to cover his tracks. Jamal forced himself to take a deep, steadying breath. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany table, masking his sheer terror with a look of extreme professional concern. "Richard, we cannot touch the reserve fund right now," Jamal said, injecting absolute certainty into his voice. "I locked the entire principal amount into highly restricted long-term high-yield offshore bonds just last week. They are securing a guaranteed 20% return, but they carry a catastrophic early withdrawal penalty. If we pull $50 million out today, the financial penalties will instantly wipe out $30 million in pure equity." Richard glared at him, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "I do not care about the penalties. If I do not satisfy these margin calls, the banks will take my buildings. Liquidate the funds, Jamal." "You are not thinking clearly." Jamal pushed back, adopting the tone of a seasoned financial advisor, reining in a panicked client. "If you suddenly liquidate offshore bonds and take a massive penalty hit, it will trigger an automatic reporting requirement. Wall Street analysts will see the move. The shareholders will know you are desperate for cash. It will signal absolute weakness to the market, and your stock price will completely tank. The banks will smell blood in the water and call in every single loan you have on the books. It will be corporate suicide." Richard paused, the harsh reality of Jamal's fabricated logic piercing through his panic. He hated showing weakness. The mere thought of his elite social circle whispering about his financial instability made him sick to his stomach. He rubbed his temples, pacing the length of the boardroom. "Then what do you suggest?" Richard demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "I need $50 million in liquid capital by Friday, or this company goes under." "We get a private bridge loan," Jamal countered smoothly, feeling a tiny sliver of hope that his deception was working. "We bypass the major commercial banks and go to a private shadow lender. They can authorize an $80 million cash injection within 24 hours, no questions asked, and keep it completely off the public balance sheets. You just need to provide unencumbered collateral to secure the loan, something the corporate banks do not already have their hooks into. Do you have any free and clear assets we can leverage? Richard stopped pacing. He stood perfectly still, his eyes narrowing as he mentally cataloged his massive portfolio of wealth. Every mansion, every yacht, every commercial tower was already leveraged or tied up in corporate cross-collateralization. He needed something clean, something incredibly valuable, and something entirely outside the company's risk profile. He walked out of the boardroom without saying a word, leaving a profusely sweating Jamal alone at the table. Richard marched straight into his private soundproof executive office. He walked past his massive desk and approached an oil painting hanging on the far wall. He swung the painting aside to reveal a biometric wall safe. He pressed his thumb to the scanner, punched in a secure code, and pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside were stacks of highly confidential family documents. Richard bypassed the corporate ledgers and reached for a thick, dusty manila envelope sitting at the very bottom of the safe. He pulled it out, brought it to his desk, and opened the clasp. He dumped the contents onto his leather blotter. It was a pristine, original commercial property deed. It was the title to a historic, highly coveted piece of commercial real estate located right in the heart of Manhattan. The building was fully paid off, generating millions in rent, and completely unencumbered by any corporate debt. It was the perfect collateral for a massive high-interest bridge loan. There was only one major complication. The deed did not belong to Richard Pierce. It had been purchased decades ago by his late father. When the old man died, he bypassed Richard completely. He left the prime Manhattan property entirely and exclusively to his favorite granddaughter. Richard stared at the legal document, his predatory gaze locking onto the name printed boldly across the top line of the deed. The property belonged to me, Natalie Pierce. Richard ran his fingers over the thick paper, a cold, ruthless calculation settling into his eyes. He had just frozen all my accounts. He had just orchestrated a lawsuit to destroy my career. He viewed me as a traitor who had abandoned the family for a penniless data analyst. In his twisted, narcissistic mind, I owed him for my entire existence. He picked up the deed, entirely willing to sacrifice my only remaining asset to save his empire. Richard did not waste a single second. He immediately summoned my mother to his private executive office. Patricia arrived wearing a sharp designer dress, looking annoyed that her afternoon spa appointment had been interrupted. Richard locked the heavy oak doors behind her, engaged the privacy soundproofing, and laid the situation out in brutal, unvarnished terms. He explained that Pierce Luxury Estates was facing total collapse by Friday. He told her the commercial banks were preparing to seize their flagship properties, which meant their mansions, their private jets, and their entire social standing were about to vanish overnight. Patricia turned completely pale. She sank into a leather chair, her hands trembling as she clutched her expensive purse. Richard did not give her time to panic. He slammed the Manhattan property deed onto the desk right in front of her. He explained his plan to secure a massive high-interest $80 million bridge loan from a ruthless shadow banking syndicate. These private lenders operated outside normal federal regulations. They did not require lengthy board approvals or extensive background checks. They only required one thing: rock-solid, unencumbered collateral. My grandfather's Manhattan property was worth easily double the loan amount. It was the perfect bait. Patricia stared at my name printed on the legal document. She hesitated, looking up at my father with a flicker of genuine fear. She pointed out that the building legally belonged to me. She reminded Richard that I had just been cut out of the family trust and would absolutely never agree to leverage my only independent asset to save a company I was just fired from. Richard leaned over the desk, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. He told her they were not going to ask for my permission. He pulled out a blank power of attorney template and a stack of my old tax returns and legal waivers from the family archive. Patricia gasped, realizing exactly what he was suggesting. Committing felony forgery carried a mandatory federal prison sentence. For a moment, the sheer legal magnitude of the crime hung heavily in the air. But Richard was a master manipulator. He immediately began twisting the narrative to soothe her conscience. He paced the room aggressively, detailing exactly why I deserved this. He reminded Patricia how ungrateful I had been at my wedding. He painted me as a vicious traitor who had abandoned my elite bloodline to marry a penniless nobody. He insisted that everything I had, including my grandfather's affection, was only possible because of the Pierce family name. Richard declared that utilizing the Manhattan property was not theft. He framed it as a mandatory family tax. He convinced Patricia that they were simply taking back what was rightfully theirs, claiming I owed them for 33 years of luxury living. Patricia listened, her initial fear rapidly melting into cold, bitter resentment. Her obsession with social status easily overpowered her maternal instincts. The thought of losing her country club memberships and being laughed at by her wealthy friends terrified her far more than breaking the law. She nodded slowly, her eyes hardening as she looked at my signature on the old tax returns. She agreed that I was a liability who needed to learn a harsh lesson about loyalty. The secret meeting turned into a tense, highly illegal workshop. Richard laid out the power of attorney documents authorizing him to pledge the Manhattan property against the shadow bank loan. He handed Patricia a high-quality fountain pen. Since my mother and I shared a very similar cursive handwriting style, Richard knew she was the best candidate to perfectly replicate my signature. Patricia practiced on a scrap piece of paper over and over again. The room was suffocatingly quiet, save for the scratching of the pen against the paper. She meticulously copied the sharp angle of the N and the looping tail of the P in my name. After 20 minutes of intense practice, Richard slid the official legal document in front of her. He placed a heavy hand on her shoulder, urging her to execute the final step. Patricia took a shallow breath, pressed the pen to the designated line, and smoothly forged my signature. The execution was flawless. It looked exactly like my handwriting. Richard immediately pulled a corporate notary stamp from his drawer. He had a corrupt notary public on his payroll who had pre-stamped blank authorization forms for moments exactly like this. Richard attached the seal, officially committing wire fraud and grand forgery. The $80 million loan application was completely weaponized and ready to be filed. They both exhaled, a wave of dark relief washing over them. They truly believed they had just successfully saved their empire and outsmarted the entire financial system. They were completely wrong. The heavy oak door to the executive office suddenly clicked and swung open. Amanda stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. She had bypassed the secretary to complain to Richard about a minor issue with her platinum credit card. Instead, she had stood silently outside the partially ajar door for the last 30 minutes. She had listened to every single word of their panicked conversation. She had watched through the crack in the doorway as her mother committed a federal felony. Richard and Patricia froze, staring at my younger sister in absolute terror. The forged document was still sitting plainly on the desk. Patricia tried to stammer out a lie, attempting to cover the paperwork with a file folder. Amanda did not look shocked. She did not look appalled that her parents had just stolen my inheritance. A slow, greedy smile spread across her perfectly manicured face. She walked directly into the office, pulled up a chair, and sat down with profound arrogance. She looked at the forged signature, then looked her father right in the eye. Amanda casually mentioned that keeping such a massive, highly illegal secret was going to be incredibly stressful for her. She noted that wire fraud was a very serious federal offense, and it would be a shame if an anonymous tip somehow made its way to the authorities. Richard's face turned purple with rage, but he was completely trapped. He demanded to know exactly what she wanted to keep her mouth shut. Amanda leaned back and admired her nails. She demanded a fully paid luxury vacation home in Aspen, completely deeded in her name, with a $500,000 interior design budget. She wanted it purchased the exact second the $80 million shadow loan cleared the bank. Richard gritted his teeth, his jaw visibly pulsing with fury. He had absolutely no choice. He glared at his golden child, nodded sharply, and agreed to her extortion. The toxic family pact was sealed. They filed the fraudulent paperwork that afternoon, entirely unaware they had just handed the rope directly to their executioner. The following Tuesday morning started like any other in our small apartment. I was sitting at the kitchen table finalizing a crisis management strategy for my new client. Leo was beside me typing away at his complex multi-monitor setup. My new business cell phone was busy handling client calls, but I had kept my old personal number active just in case any legacy contacts needed to reach me. At exactly 10:15, that old phone buzzed against the cheap laminate counter. I glanced at the caller ID. It displayed an unknown corporate number from a Manhattan area code. I answered with my standard professional greeting, assuming it was a confused former client. Instead, a young, nervous-sounding man introduced himself as a junior compliance officer for a private lending firm called Vanguard Credit and Trust. He apologized profusely for the intrusion, stating he was just conducting a routine secondary verification on a recently finalized commercial bridge loan. He asked if he was speaking with Natalie Pierce. I confirmed my identity, mildly annoyed, but assuming my father had somehow listed me as an emergency contact on one of his corporate accounts. The compliance officer cleared his throat and asked a simple question that instantly made the blood freeze in my veins. He requested that I verify the secondary mailing address for the $80 million commercial lien placed against my property located in the financial district of Manhattan. The world around me stopped spinning. The ambient noise of the city outside our window faded into a dull, echoing ring. I asked the young man to repeat himself, praying I had misunderstood his rapid corporate jargon. He obliged, reading aloud the exact legal description of the historic Manhattan building my grandfather had left exclusively to me. He confirmed that a massive high-interest loan had been fully executed and secured using my pristine, unencumbered property as the sole collateral. He casually mentioned that my signature on the power of attorney documents had been notarized just a few days prior by the Pierce Luxury Estates corporate office. My voice went completely dead. I told the junior officer that the address on file was correct and promptly ended the call. I did not scream or drop the phone. I operated with the chilling mechanical precision of a seasoned crisis director who had just discovered a catastrophic emergency. I opened a new tab on my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I logged directly into the New York Public Property Records database. I bypassed the standard search features and accessed the deep legal filings using my professional credentials. I pulled up the deed history for my grandfather's building. The document loaded on the screen, and the undeniable proof of my family's betrayal stared right back at me in stark black and white. There it was, a fresh, legally binding lien for $80 million attached to my inheritance. Attached to the filing was a scanned copy of the power of attorney authorization. I zoomed in on the signature line. It was a perfect forgery. The sharp angles, the exact looping tail of the letters. Someone had meticulously copied my handwriting. I knew instantly it was my mother. Patricia was the only person on earth who shared that exact cursive style and had the icy nerve to execute it under my father's command. They had actually done it. They had committed grand felony wire fraud and corporate forgery just to save their failing empire. They had stolen the only pure, untainted thing my grandfather had ever given me. Richard and Patricia Pierce had weaponized my identity, treating my future like a disposable asset to cover up Jamal's massive financial failures. The betrayal was so profound, so deeply twisted, that it bypassed sadness entirely and mutated into a white-hot, all-consuming fury. I shoved my chair back so violently it crashed against the kitchen wall. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the tiny apartment. I slammed my laptop shut, grabbed my heavy winter coat from the back of the door, and snatched my car keys off the counter. I was breathing heavily, my chest heaving with a rage I had never experienced before in my entire life. I was going to march straight into the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office downtown. I was going to hand a federal prosecutor the property records, provide a sworn affidavit that my signature was forged, and demand they arrest Richard and Patricia Pierce immediately. I wanted them in handcuffs. I wanted them stripped of their designer clothes, dragged out of their opulent mansion, and thrown into a federal holding cell before the sun went down. I turned toward the front door, slipping my arms aggressively into my coat sleeves. Leo had stopped typing. He watched me with sharp, calculating eyes. He stood up from his desk, his tall frame instantly dominating the narrow hallway. "Move, Leo," I ordered, my voice shaking with raw anger. "My parents just forged my signature on an $80 million loan. They stole my grandfather's building. I am going to the police station right now, and I am going to watch them rot in a federal prison." Leo did not move out of the way. Instead, he stepped directly in front of the door, physically blocking my exit. He reached out and gently placed his large, warm hands on my tense shoulders. His grip was firm but incredibly grounding. He looked down at me, his dark eyes entirely devoid of panic. "Do not call the cops," Leo said quietly, his tone echoing with a dangerous, terrifying level of authority. I glared at him, bewildered by his calm reaction to a massive federal crime. I asked him why I should let them get away with stealing my only asset. Leo shook his head slowly. He explained the reality of the American justice system for the ultra-wealthy. "If you call the police," he said, his voice dropping to a smooth, predatory pitch, "Richard and Patricia will hire the most expensive defense attorneys in the country. They will drag the case out for years in civil and criminal court. And when they finally get convicted, they will go to a white-collar resort prison for 3 years. They will play tennis, read books, and eventually get out with their arrogant pride completely intact." I stared at him, my breathing slowing as his calculated logic pierced through my blinding rage. He was absolutely right. A short stint in a luxury federal camp was not a real punishment for people like my parents. It was a temporary inconvenience. Leo moved his hands from my shoulders and gently cupped my face. A dark, ruthless smile spread across his lips, transforming him from a quiet data analyst into something incredibly lethal. "If you let me handle it," Leo whispered, his eyes locked intensely on mine, "I will take their empire." I stared at my husband, searching his face for any sign of a joke. There was none. His expression was entirely composed, carved from absolute certainty. I dropped my keys onto the kitchen counter. The metallic clatter sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet apartment. I demanded that he explain himself immediately. I asked him how exactly a mid-level data analyst who drove a 10-year-old car and wore faded cotton shirts planned to single-handedly dismantle one of the most entrenched luxury real estate developers on the eastern seaboard. I reminded him that my father had billions of dollars in assets, an army of ruthless corporate lawyers, and the political connections to crush anyone who stood in his way. Leo did not answer right away. He took my heavy winter coat by the shoulders, slid it down my arms, and hung it back on the door hook. He took my hand and led me away from the front door, guiding me back toward the heavy metal desk in the corner of our living room. He sat down in his desk chair and pulled me gently down to sit on his knee. He told me that he had never lied about what he did for a living. He told me that he really did analyze data, but the data he analyzed controlled billions of dollars in international corporate debt. He reached forward and woke up his multi-monitor setup. I watched as the familiar spreadsheets he usually kept on his screen vanished. He initiated a deep system reboot. A solid black screen appeared, prompting a series of highly complex security clearances. Leo typed in a rapid sequence of alphanumeric codes, followed by a biometric fingerprint scan on a hidden peripheral device. The screens flared to life. The interface was unlike anything I had ever seen in the corporate world. It was a massive interconnected network of global financial feeds, real-time market valuations, and offshore banking ledgers. In the dead center of the primary monitor, a sharp, minimalist logo materialized in crisp white lettering against the dark background. It read, Apex. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that exact name. Anyone who worked in corporate public relations or high-level finance knew that name. Apex Holdings was a terrifyingly powerful private equity firm known for executing hostile takeovers. They were the invisible apex predators of Wall Street. They bought up massive portfolios of distressed, debt-cornered, failing corporations and ruthlessly stripped them down for parts. Their boardroom tactics were legendary, leaving entire industries trembling in their wake. The CEO of Apex Holdings was notoriously reclusive. He never gave interviews, never attended high society galas, and never allowed his photograph to be published in business magazines. I turned my head slowly, looking at the man I had married. The man who ate leftover pizza with me on the floor and fixed our leaky apartment faucet just 2 days ago. I asked him if he worked for Apex. Leo looked me dead in the eye and stated that he did not work for Apex. He founded it. He was the sole owner and chief executive officer of the entire holding group. My mind struggled to process the sheer magnitude of his confession. I asked him why he lived like this. I asked him why he tolerated the relentless abuse and humiliation from my father and Jamal, when he could have crushed them with a single bank statement. Leo smiled a genuine and grounding expression. He explained that true power never needs to announce itself in a crowded room. He told me he despised the toxic performative culture of elite society. He surrounded himself with ordinary things because he wanted an authentic life. He wanted a partner who loved him for who he was, not for the balance in his offshore accounts. He told me he married me because I was the only person in my entire bloodline with a soul, a conscience, and a backbone. Then his smile vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating intensity of a corporate executioner. He turned his attention back to the glowing monitors. He explained that while my father and Jamal were busy trying to humiliate us and destroy my public relations firm, he had been quietly running a massive financial autopsy on Pierce Luxury Estates. He told me that Jamal had completely drained the family reserve funds. He told me that my father was currently drowning in catastrophic margin calls. Leo typed a quick command into his keyboard. A highly classified banking ledger appeared on the screen. He pointed to a specific transaction that had been flagged and isolated in bright red. It was the $80 million commercial bridge loan that Richard and Patricia had fraudulently secured using my grandfather's Manhattan property as collateral. Leo explained how the shadow banking world operated. The predatory lending firm that my parents had used to secure the cash did not actually hold on to their own debt. They instantly bundled their high-risk loans and sold them to larger institutional investors for immediate liquidity. Leo had set an automated algorithmic trap, the exact night Jamal dropped that receipt in the steakhouse. The moment Pierce Luxury Estates executed a new debt contract, Apex Holdings automatically purchased the paper from the originators. Leo looked at me, his dark eyes reflecting the harsh light of the monitors. He told me that my parents did not owe $80 million to a random shadow bank anymore. The original lenders had completely washed their hands of the transaction. As of 10 minutes ago, they owed the entire sum directly and exclusively to him. He owned the debt, he owned the collateral, he effectively owned my father's entire corporate existence. I stared at the screen, a profound wave of vindication washing away the last remnants of my panic. My father thought he had cleverly outsmarted the system by forging my signature. Instead, he had walked blindly into an inescapable financial slaughterhouse built by the exact man he had publicly ridiculed. I asked Leo what we were going to do next. He did not hesitate. He reached across the desk and picked up his secured smartphone. He bypassed his contact list and dialed a direct extension. He placed the phone on the desk and activated speaker mode. The line rang exactly one time before a sharp professional voice answered, asking for instructions. It was the chief legal counsel for Apex Holdings. Leo kept his eyes locked on mine as he delivered the final devastating blow. Trigger the default clause on the Pierce loan. Leo commanded, his voice echoing with absolute merciless authority that left absolutely zero room for negotiation. Immediate repayment required in 48 hours. I would later learn exactly how the execution played out inside the glass walls of Pierce Luxury Estates. At precisely 9 o'clock the following morning, the private fax machines, secure email servers, and certified couriers simultaneously delivered the catastrophic legal payload. It was a formal notice of immediate default from the legal department of Apex Holdings. The document was an absolute masterpiece of corporate aggression. It cited an obscure but entirely legal breach of covenant, triggered by my parents' fraudulent collateral assignment. The $80 million bridge loan they had illegally secured using my signature was no longer payable in comfortable monthly installments. The entire principal plus massive punitive interest penalties was due in exactly 48 hours. If the funds did not clear the Apex holding accounts by the strict deadline, My father's entire empire would be seized, dismantled, and liquidated to satisfy the massive debt. Richard Pierce was a man accustomed to bullying his way out of consequences. His immediate reaction was not fear, but extreme blinding indignation. He stormed into his massive executive office, slammed the heavy oak doors, and began furiously working the phones. He called state senators whose political campaigns he had heavily funded over the past decade. He called senior banking regulators he regularly played golf with at the exclusive country club. He even called the ruthless corporate defense attorneys who had successfully frozen my bank accounts just a day prior. Every single phone call ended in abject, humiliating failure. The moment his political and legal allies heard the name Apex Holdings, they immediately backed away, treating my father like a radioactive liability. Nobody was willing to step into the crosshairs of a faceless private equity predator with limitless capital. They all told my father the exact same thing: pay the debt immediately, or prepare to file for federal bankruptcy protection. There was absolutely no legal loophole, no political favor, and no backdoor corporate deal that could save him from an apex execution. Cornered, isolated, and rapidly running out of time, my father shifted his frantic focus to the only financial lifeline he believed he had left. He summoned my brother-in-law Jamal to the executive boardroom. Jamal walked in sweating profusely, his arrogant swagger completely erased. My father slammed the thick default notice onto the polished mahogany table. He demanded that Jamal immediately unlock the $150 million family reserve fund. Richard screamed that he did not care about the early withdrawal penalties or the offshore bond restrictions Jamal had fabricated just days ago. He needed $85 million wired directly to Apex Holdings by tomorrow afternoon, or the entire Pierce legacy would be erased from the face of the earth. Jamal stood frozen at the end of the long conference table. His expensive designer suit hung loosely on his trembling frame. He looked desperately toward the glass doors, searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. My sister Amanda, who had aggressively followed her husband into the boardroom, demanding to know why her platinum credit cards were suddenly being declined at luxury boutiques, watched the tense scene unfold with mounting horror. Richard slammed his fists violently against the table, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He ordered Jamal to initiate the wire transfer immediately, threatening to ruin him if he hesitated for another second. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Jamal fell to his knees. The flashy, arrogant stockbroker who had thrown a crumpled $100 bill at my husband's feet just months ago was now sobbing uncontrollably on the cold boardroom floor. He choked out the devastating truth. He confessed that there were no offshore bonds. There were no high-yield investments securing their future. The entire reserve fund was completely gone. He had burned through every single penny, covering up illegal margin calls, disastrous cryptocurrency investments, and massive catastrophic gambling debts. The confession shattered the final remnants of my father's sanity. Richard Pierce let out a guttural, primal roar of pure, unfiltered rage. He lunged across the distance between them, grabbed Jamal by the lapels of his custom velvet jacket, and hurled him violently against the glass wall of the boardroom. The impact rattled the heavy panes. Richard began striking Jamal, completely losing control, screaming that he had single-handedly destroyed the family. Jamal cowered, raising his arms to shield his face, offering absolutely no resistance as my father unleashed decades of unchecked aggression. Amanda began to shriek. Her piercing screams echoed through the executive floor, drawing the attention of terrified employees. She was not screaming because her husband was being physically assaulted. She was screaming because the terrifying reality of her situation had just crashed down upon her. There was no reserve fund. Her lavish allowance was gone. Her designer wardrobe, her frequent trips to Europe, and her status as an elite socialite were evaporating right in front of her eyes. She was legally married to a penniless fraud, and her father was a day away from total financial ruin. The golden child was rapidly plummeting into the exact same gutter she had so gleefully banished me to. Security guards finally burst into the boardroom, physically dragging my father away from a bruised and bleeding Jamal. Richard stood panting, his expensive suit torn, his knuckles bloodied. The digital clock on the boardroom wall ticked down mercilessly. He had exactly 24 hours left before Apex Holdings initiated the hostile asset seizure. His liquid cash was entirely wiped out. His credit lines were fully severed. As he stared at the eviction notices already drafting in the minds of his creditors, a dark, desperate realization washed over him. There was only one asset left that held enough value to cover the Apex debt. It was the Manhattan commercial property he had illegally leveraged. But to sell the building outright and generate immediate clean cash to pay off the loan, a forged power of attorney would not be enough. Institutional buyers would demand a heavily scrutinized voluntary transfer of deed directly from the legal owner. Richard wiped a drop of sweat from his forehead. He realized he desperately needed me. He needed his discarded, disowned daughter to officially sign away her rights to her grandfather's inheritance so he could sell it to the highest bidder. It was his only way out. The very next evening, the heavy silence of our cramped apartment was shattered by a frantic, aggressive pounding at our front door. Leo and I were sitting at our wobbly kitchen table eating takeout. I glanced at the clock on the stove. It was nearly 9 at night. The knocking continued, desperate and unyielding, vibrating through the thin drywall. I stood up, walked to the peeling wooden door, and peered through the scratched peephole. My stomach plummeted. Standing in the dimly lit, stained hallway of our low-income building was my entire family. Richard, Patricia, Amanda, and a heavily bruised Jamal were huddled together, looking wildly out of place under the flickering fluorescent bulb. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open just a few inches. Before I could even ask what they were doing here, my father pushed his way inside. He did not look like the ruthless corporate dictator who had publicly disowned me at my wedding. He looked completely unraveled. His eyes were wide with manufactured panic, and his posture was hunched in a pathetic display of submission. He immediately reached out, attempting to wrap me in a tight, fatherly hug. I stepped back so quickly I nearly tripped over the threshold, crossing my arms over my chest and staring at him in absolute disgust. Patricia squeezed through the doorway right behind him, followed closely by Amanda and Jamal. My mother immediately launched into a theatrical performance. She covered her face with her manicured hands, forcing out loud, dramatic sobs that echoed off the thin walls of our living room. Her pristine white cashmere coat brushed against the chipped paint of our entryway, but she did not seem to care. She reached out and grabbed my arm, her grip desperate and clinging. She cried that she had missed me so much, claiming that the last few months apart had been pure agony for her maternal heart. It was a staggering display of psychological manipulation. The woman who had literally ripped a diamond tiara from my head and banished me from her social circle was now weeping on my cheap linoleum floor, begging for my forgiveness. Amanda stood near the kitchen counter looking completely terrified. The usual arrogant sneer was entirely wiped from her face. She was practically vibrating with anxiety, clutching a designer handbag against her chest, as if someone was about to snatch it away. The neon light from the convenience store across the street cast harsh shadows across her pale features. Jamal stayed near the back of the group. He was sporting a massive dark purple bruise along his jawline from his violent boardroom encounter with my father. He refused to meet my eyes, shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot, looking like a cornered animal. I demanded to know exactly why they had invaded my home unannounced. My father took a deep, shaky breath, playing the role of a desperate patriarch trying to protect his flock. He told me that the family was under attack. He claimed that a ruthless, shadowy corporate predator named Apex Holdings was orchestrating an illegal, hostile takeover of Pierce Luxury Estates. He spun a wild, fabricated tale about how this faceless equity firm was using predatory legal loopholes to seize all their assets, destroy their legacy, and leave the entire family destitute on the streets. He looked at me with wide, pleading eyes. He told me that despite our recent disagreements, we were still blood. He insisted that family must always stick together when faced with an external enemy. He claimed he came here tonight to apologize, to mend the bridge between us, and to ask his brilliant, capable daughter to help him save the empire he had built for our future. I stared at him, feeling a cold, clinical detachment. I knew exactly who Apex Holdings was. I knew exactly who the ruthless predator was because he was currently standing in the kitchen quietly drinking a glass of water. And I knew perfectly well that my father had no intention of apologizing for anything. Richard reached into his expensive coat pocket and pulled out a thick, legally binding document. He smoothed it out on my small dining table, pushing aside a stack of napkins. The bold heading across the top read, "Voluntary Transfer of Deed." He handed me an expensive silver pen. His voice dropped to a low, urgent whisper. He explained that Apex Holdings had somehow attached a fraudulent lien to my grandfather's Manhattan commercial property. He told me that the only way to protect my inheritance from this evil corporation was to sign the deed over to him immediately. If I signed the voluntary transfer, he claimed his legal team could shield the asset, sell it to a trusted private buyer, and use the clean cash to fight off the hostile takeover. He promised me that once the dust settled, he would personally reimburse me for double the property's value. It was a breathtaking lie. He was standing in my apartment, staring me dead in the eye and asking me to legally surrender my only asset so he could pay off the exact debt he had secretly forged my signature to acquire. He wanted me to hand him the bullet to load into his gun. If I signed that paper, I would be voluntarily relinquishing my ownership legally, absolving him of the wire fraud and felony forgery he committed to get the shadow loan in the first place. Patricia leaned forward, her fake tears flowing faster. She begged me to sign the paper. She cried that Amanda would lose her home, that the family name would be ruined, and that they would have absolutely nothing left. She pleaded with me to be the bigger person to show them the grace they had admittedly failed to show me at my wedding. She claimed they were just acting out of emotion that day, but now they realized how much they truly needed me. They were using every emotional manipulation tactic in their arsenal, desperately trying to leverage my lifelong desire for their approval to secure their own survival. Leo walked out of the kitchen, his footsteps completely silent on the cheap floorboards. He was wearing faded jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, blending perfectly into the humble surroundings of our apartment. He stepped up beside me gently, placing his hand on the small of my back. He looked down at the voluntary transfer of deed resting on the table, reading the legal jargon with a swift, calculating gaze. Jamal saw Leo approaching, and his fear instantly curdled back into his default arrogance. The disgraced stockbroker could not handle his own humiliating downfall, so he immediately sought to exert dominance over the only person he believed was beneath him. Jamal glared at my husband, his bruised face twisting into an ugly, contemptuous sneer. "Get out of the room, data boy," Jamal snapped, pointing an aggressive finger toward the bedroom door. "This is billionaire business. You have absolutely no place being here." Leo did not flinch. He did not raise his voice or react to the insult. He simply leaned his broad shoulder against the wooden doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. A slow, terrifyingly cold smirk spread across his face, transforming his relaxed features into a mask of pure corporate lethality. "Oh, I wouldn't miss this for the world," Leo said. I picked up the thick stack of legal papers from the small dining table. The expensive parchment felt heavy in my hands, a stark contrast to the cheap laminate surface it had just rested on. I did not rush. I took my time reading through the dense, convoluted legalese that my father's corporate attorneys had hastily drafted. The clauses were meticulously designed to look like a standard real estate transaction, but the underlying intent was blindingly obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. Buried on the third page was a broad indemnification clause. It explicitly stated that by signing the transfer, I would hold Richard Pierce and Pierce Luxury Estates completely harmless against any prior encumbrances, liens, or legal actions associated with the property. It was a retroactive shield. If I signed my name on that dotted line, I would not just be surrendering my grandfather's historic Manhattan building. I would be legally pardoning my parents for committing felony wire fraud and blatant forgery. They wanted me to absorb their criminal liability and thank them for the privilege. I lowered the document and looked directly into my father's eyes. The fake, desperate warmth he had projected just moments ago was already beginning to slip. He was sweating, his breathing shallow and rapid. He expected me to cave. He expected 33 years of psychological conditioning to kick in, forcing me to prioritize the Pierce family empire over my own survival. He genuinely believed that the fear of his disapproval would compel me to hand over an $80 million lifeline. I gripped the top edge of the document with both hands. I locked my gaze with his, ensuring he could see the absolute icy void where my daughterly devotion used to reside. I pulled my hands apart, ripping the thick stack of legal papers straight down the middle. The sharp, tearing sound echoed loudly in the cramped apartment. Patricia gasped, taking a sudden step backward. Jamal's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. I placed the torn halves together and ripped them again, reducing my father's only escape route into useless shredded quarters. I let the pieces fall from my fingers. They fluttered down, landing in a chaotic pile on the scuffed linoleum floor right at Richard's expensive leather shoes. The silence that engulfed the room was completely deafening. The manufactured love, the theatrical tears, the desperate pleas for family unity vanished in an instant. The illusion shattered into a million jagged pieces, exposing the raw, ugly truth beneath their polished exteriors. Richard erupted into a violent, terrifying rage. His face turned a deep, mottled purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched collar as he let out a scream of pure, unadulterated hatred. He lunged forward, his fists clenched, but Leo instantly shifted his weight, positioning his broad frame squarely between me and my father. Richard stopped breathing heavily, hurling vile insults over Leo's shoulder. He called me an ungrateful traitor. He screamed that I was a worthless parasite who was deliberately destroying the bloodline just to spite him. He roared that he had given me an elite education, clothed me in luxury, and fed me from silver spoons, only for me to stab him in the back when he needed me the most. He yelled that my grandfather would be absolutely disgusted by my sheer selfishness. I stood perfectly still behind Leo, feeling nothing but a profound, liberating emptiness. The words that once would have shattered my heart now bounced off me like pebbles against armor. Patricia dropped her fake weeping entirely, her face contorted into a mask of pure, vicious malice. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at my face. She shrieked that I was a disgusting mistake of a daughter. She screamed that I was dead to them, a total disgrace to the Pierce family name. She vowed that she would personally ensure I was banned from every social circle, every charity board, and every business registry in the country. She swore she would make my life an absolute, inescapable hell for turning my back on my own mother. Beside her, Amanda completely lost her mind. The golden child did not care about family loyalty or corporate legacy. She only cared about her incoming financial slaughter. Amanda threw a massive screaming tantrum right in the middle of our tiny living room. She stomped her designer boots on the floor, screeching about her frozen platinum credit cards. She wailed that she was going to lose her promised vacation home in Aspen. She shrieked that her entire life as an elite socialite was being ripped away, and she blamed me for every single second of it. She screamed that she could not live in a basic apartment, that she could not survive without her massive monthly allowance, and that I was a horrible, evil sister for letting this happen to her. She grabbed Jamal by his suit jacket, shaking him violently, demanding he fix the situation immediately. Jamal just stood there looking absolutely defeated, swatting her hands away in miserable silence. The sheer chaos was a pathetic, pitiful display of wealthy entitlement collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. They were thrashing like cornered animals, completely unable to process the reality of their impending doom. Richard grabbed Patricia by the arm, violently pulling her toward the front door. He shoved Jamal and Amanda out into the dimly lit hallway, his chest heaving with exertion. He stood on the threshold of our apartment, looking back at me with a gaze filled with unparalleled venomous hatred. His entire empire was burning to the ground, and he was determined to inflict one final verbal wound. Richard pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. His voice dropped to a harsh, guttural growl that echoed in the quiet stairwell. I will personally hand my entire company over to Apex Holdings tomorrow before I ever let you see a single dime of my money. Leo leaned casually against the wooden doorframe. He looked at my furious, desperate father, a cold, predatory smile spreading effortlessly across his face. Leo chuckled a low, terrifyingly calm sound, noted Richard. The heavy wooden door slammed shut, vibrating the cheap metal hinges of our apartment frame. Their frantic footsteps echoed down the stairwell, fading into the humid city night. I stood in the center of our cramped living room, the shredded pieces of the fraudulent deed scattered across the linoleum floor. I looked at Leo. He did not celebrate. He simply walked back to his desk, woke up his monitors, and prepared for the final execution. At precisely 9 o'clock the following morning, the 48-hour grace period officially expired. The digital countdown on Leo's secure server reached 0. He hit a single key. Across the city, the financial guillotine dropped on Pierce luxury estates. The hostile takeover was not a quiet administrative procedure. It was a highly coordinated, aggressive corporate strike designed to completely paralyze my father's empire before he could hide a single asset. A fleet of black luxury SUVs pulled up to the glass facade of the Pierce headquarters. A specialized restructuring team from Apex Holdings marched through the revolving doors. There were 30 of them, forensic accountants, corporate litigators, and asset seizure specialists, wearing immaculate tailored suits. They moved with terrifying synchronized efficiency. They bypassed the marble reception desk, ignoring the frantic protests of the lobby security guards. The lead attorney, a tall, ruthless man holding a leather briefcase, walked directly into the private executive elevator and keyed his override clearance. He rode straight to the top floor. Inside the executive suite, Richard Pierce was pacing behind his desk. He was red-faced, exhausted, and gripping a glass of scotch. He had spent the entire night calling every contact he had, begging for a last-minute bailout. Nobody answered. When the heavy oak doors to his office swung open, he expected to see his own legal team. Instead, the Apex restructuring director stepped inside, flanked by 2 armed private security contractors. The director calmly placed a massive stack of federal injunctions, asset seizure authorizations, and immediate freeze orders directly onto my father's desk. At that exact moment, the technological blackout initiated. Every computer screen in the entire building went entirely black. A stark white Apex Holdings logo appeared on hundreds of monitors. The company's servers were instantly locked down to prevent the destruction of financial evidence. Down the hall, Jamal was frantically typing on his keyboard, desperately trying to route any remaining scraps of capital into a hidden offshore account. His screen suddenly froze. The keyboard went completely dead. He slammed his fists against his desk in absolute terror, realizing he was entirely locked out of the system. The financial freeze was absolute. It did not just target the corporate accounts. Because Richard had illegally cross-collateralized his personal wealth to prop up his failing business, the Apex algorithms systematically locked down every single asset attached to his social security number. Across town, Patricia was attempting to buy a $20,000 diamond necklace to soothe her anxiety. Her exclusive black card was declined. She handed the cashier another card. Declined. Every personal checking account, every offshore trust, and every mutual fund associated with the Pierce family was instantly frozen solid. Back in the executive office, my father stared at the legal documents in sheer disbelief. He screamed at the Apex director, demanding they leave his building immediately. He threatened to sue them for trespassing. The director did not even blink. He opened the top folder and slid a high-resolution scan of the forged Manhattan property deed across the desk. Next to it, he placed a detailed forensic accounting report outlining Jamal's massive embezzlement. The director looked my father dead in the eye and delivered the fatal ultimatum. He explained that Apex Holdings now owned the entirety of the $80 million defaulted loan. He informed Richard that they possessed undeniable ironclad proof of felony wire fraud, corporate forgery, and gross embezzlement. The director stated that Richard had exactly 2 options. He could resist the takeover, in which case Apex would immediately hand the entire portfolio of evidence over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, guaranteeing Richard, Patricia, and Jamal would spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary. Or the director continued, his voice devoid of any emotion. Richard could choose the second option. He could voluntarily surrender. The director instructed my father to gather his family and attend a mandatory compliance meeting at the Apex Holdings Global Headquarters in Manhattan the following afternoon. At that meeting, Richard would sign over 100% of his corporate shares, his voting rights, and his equity to Apex Holdings. In exchange for the total surrender of his empire, Apex would agree to keep the forged documents out of the hands of federal prosecutors. My father collapsed into his leather chair. The glass of scotch slipped from his fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. The reality of his situation finally crushed his boundless arrogance. He was utterly trapped. He had no money, no leverage, and absolutely no way out. The empire he had built, the legacy he had prioritized over his own daughter, was completely gone. The restructuring team cleared the building, sending hundreds of panicked employees home. Richard, Jamal, and Amanda were escorted out by security. They drove back to their sprawling suburban mansion in absolute deafening silence. The massive house already felt like a tomb. Patricia was waiting for them in the grand foyer, surrounded by shopping bags she had been unable to pay for, her face pale with mounting hysteria. Richard gathered his family in the opulent living room. The panic in the air was thick enough to choke on. Amanda was weeping uncontrollably on the velvet sofa, mourning the loss of her elite socialite status. Jamal sat with his head buried in his hands, trembling with the visceral fear of impending prison time. Patricia paced the room wildly, demanding that Richard fix the situation. But Richard Pierce was incapable of accepting defeat gracefully. His narcissistic pride simply would not allow him to surrender like a beaten animal. He refused to show weakness to a faceless corporate predator. He stood up straight, adjusting the collar of his ruined suit. He looked at his weeping wife, his terrified son-in-law, and his spoiled youngest daughter. His eyes hardened with a delusional, desperate arrogance. He ordered them to stop crying. He told them that tomorrow they were going to Manhattan to face the CEO of Apex Holdings. He commanded them to go to their closets and pull out their most expensive tailored suits, their finest designer dresses, and their most valuable jewelry. He wanted them draped in undeniable luxury. "We will walk into Apex with our heads high," Richard declared, his voice shaking with a pathetic manufactured bravado. "We are Pierces. We do not bow to anyone." The next afternoon, the blistering July heat radiated off the concrete sidewalks of Manhattan, but inside the sprawling glass and steel skyscraper of Apex Holdings, the air was freezing. The building rose 60 stories into the skyline, an imposing, brutal monolith of corporate dominance that seemed designed specifically to make anyone who entered feel completely insignificant. Richard walked through the revolving doors first, his chest artificially puffed out, trying his absolute best to project the aura of a powerful billionaire. Behind him came Patricia, her heels clicking aggressively on the polished black marble floor, her neck draped in her most expensive pearl necklace. Amanda followed, clutching Jamal's arms so tightly her knuckles were white. Jamal looked like a man walking toward a firing squad. The massive purple bruise on his jaw was partially covered by his starched collar, and he kept adjusting his tie, his hands trembling violently. Bypassing the public elevators, a stern security guard checked their IDs against a master corporate registry and escorted them directly to a private express lift. The elevator ride was completely silent. Nobody spoke. The digital floor indicator ticked upward with terrifying speed, 30, 40, 50, 60, until a soft chime announced their arrival at the penthouse level. The doors slid open to reveal a minimalist reception area with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire New York harbor. A sleek, polished desk sat in the center of the room, behind which stood an executive assistant who looked at my family with an expression of cold, professional detachment. She did not bow. She did not offer a warm greeting. She simply stood up and guided them through a pair of frosted glass doors into the main boardroom. The room was vast and intimidating. A massive solid oak conference table stretched across the center of the space, surrounded by 12 high-backed leather ergonomic chairs. The far wall was made entirely of glass, offering a sweeping panoramic view of the financial district. Richard strode to the far end of the table, pulling out the largest leather chair and sitting down with a theatrical sigh. He was determined to play the part of an equal partner negotiating a high-level corporate merger rather than a desperate bankrupted debtor surrendering his life's work. Patricia sat tightly beside him, smoothing her designer dress, while Amanda and Jamal took seats across from them. Despite their expensive clothes and valuable jewelry, the illusion of their dominance was rapidly fracturing. The heavy, suffocating silence of the penthouse began to completely erode their manufactured bravado. Jamal was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically toward the door every time he heard a sound in the hallway. Amanda kept checking her reflection in her compact mirror, her face pale with an anxiety she could no longer conceal. Botoy, unable to handle the tense waiting, slammed his hand lightly against the oak table to summon the executive assistant who had remained standing quietly by the door. "Bring us some imported sparkling water," Richard demanded, his voice carrying an artificial forced boom that betrayed his underlying panic. "And let your reclusive CEO know that Richard Pierce is here. My time is incredibly valuable, and I do not intend to be kept waiting like a petitioner." The assistant simply nodded, her face entirely unreadable, and stepped out of the room to fulfill the request. Patricia reached across the table and touched my father's arm, trying to bolster his flailing confidence. She whispered that they still held the upper hand, that Apex needed their signature to smoothly transition the real estate portfolio without a massive public scandal. Amanda tried to join in, muttering that once this corporate nonsense was sorted out, Richard needed to immediately authorize the purchase of her Aspen home to compensate her for all this emotional stress. Jamal said absolutely nothing. He just stared at the blank surface of the oak table, a man entirely consumed by the visceral fear of a federal prison cell. 10 minutes ticked by on the minimalist wall clock. The psychological pressure in the room was reaching a breaking point. Richard was pacing behind his chair now, his hands shoved deeply into his pockets, his knuckles white. He muttered to himself, rehearsing the legal threats and aggressive counterproposals he planned to throw at the Apex CEO the moment he walked through the door. He was going to demand a retention of minority shares. He was going to demand a seat on the new advisory board. He was still entirely delusional, believing his name and legacy carried weight inside a private equity fortress. At exactly 2 o'clock, the electronic lock on the boardroom doors clicked. The sharp metallic sound cut through the silence of the room like a gunshot. Jamal flinched violently, nearly knocking over his glass of water. Amanda stopped whispering. Richard froze in his tracks, turning his body toward the entryway, his face hardening into what he believed was an intimidating mask of pure billionaire authority. Patricia stood up beside him, arranging her pearls, preparing to look down her nose at whatever corporate raider was about to enter. The heavy soundproof oak doors swung open. The room fell into a dead, suffocating, absolute silence. A woman stepped across the threshold. She was not a faceless corporate suit. She was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored midnight blue suit that fit her perfectly, accentuating her powerful, commanding posture. Her hair was flawlessly styled, her expression entirely composed, and her eyes carried a cold, piercing intelligence that left absolutely zero room for negotiation. She walked into the room with the effortless, predatory confidence of a person who owned every single square inch of the building they stood in. Botoy stared at her, his mouth completely dropping open as his brain entirely refused to process the image in front of him. Patricia's hand flew to her throat, her fingers accidentally crushing the pearl necklace against her skin. Amanda gasped loudly, her compact mirror slipping from her fingers and shattering against the oak table. Jamal looked as if he had just seen a ghost rise from the grave. The woman who had just walked into the most powerful boardroom on Fowall. The woman who held the absolute fate of their entire corporate empire in her hands was me, Natalie Pierce. Richard shot up from his leather chair. The seat scraped violently against the polished floor. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. His face, already pale from the mounting stress of his financial ruin, suddenly flooded with a dark, furious crimson. He stared at me as if I were an apparition, but his shock rapidly mutated into an ugly, predictable rage. He slammed his palms flat onto the oak table, leaning forward with the aggressive posture he always used to intimidate his subordinates. "What the hell are you doing here?" Natalie. Richard bellowed, his voice echoing sharply against the glass walls of the boardroom. He sneered, his eyes scanning my custom suit with absolute contempt. Are you sleeping with an apex executive to get back at me? The sheer audacity of his accusation was breathtaking. Even while standing in the epicenter of his own catastrophic failure, mere moments away from losing his entire corporate empire, his mind immediately defaulted to misogyny and control. He genuinely believed that the only possible way I could stand in this penthouse was by trading my dignity to a powerful man. He could not fathom that I possessed my own power. Patricia gasped, clutching her pearls tighter, her face twisting into a mask of maternal disappointment. She took a step toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the black marble. She pointed a trembling finger at the door. She ordered me to leave the premises, instantly claiming that I was intentionally trying to sabotage their final negotiation. She shrieked that my presence was a vindictive distraction and I had no right to interfere with family business. She completely ignored the fact that she had recently forged my signature to secure the very loan that was destroying them. Amanda chimed in, her voice shrill and desperate. She pounded her fists, wailing that I was ruining everything just like I ruined my own wedding. She demanded that I call security on myself, fully believing the delusional narrative that they were the victims of my petty revenge. She accused me of being a jealous, bitter sister who could not stand to see her family succeed. Jamal was the only one who remained completely silent. The disgraced stockbroker was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically between me and the empty chair at the head of the table. His survival instincts, honed by years of deception, were finally screaming at him. He realized that my calm, unbothered demeanor was not the posture of a scorned daughter. It was the stance of a corporate executioner. He swallowed hard, sinking lower into his seat, terrified of the impending fallout. He wiped a drop of cold sweat from his bruised jawline, silently praying for an escape route that did not exist. I ignored my mother's shrieks and my sister's frantic tantrums. I did not flinch at my father's disgusting accusation. I walked slowly across the room, the crisp sound of my footsteps cutting through their chaotic noise. I moved toward the massive high-backed leather chair, situated at the right side of the executive table, directly adjacent to the head position. I pulled the chair out, smoothed the fabric of my tailored suit, and gracefully sat down. I rested my forearms on the cool, polished oak. I looked my father dead in the eye, watching the confusion ripple through his furious expression as he tried to comprehend my blatant defiance. "No, Dad," I said, my voice steady, carrying a calm, lethal authority that instantly silenced the room. "I am just here to support my husband." Richard let out a harsh, barking laugh. It was a sound devoid of humor, laced with pure, desperate arrogance. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white from the pressure. He mocked me, sneering that my husband was a penniless data entry clerk who could not afford to step foot in this building, let alone influence a multi-million-dollar corporate restructuring. He demanded to know if Leo had begged an IT manager for a guest pass just so we could sneak upstairs and watch the Pierce family negotiate a financial settlement. Patricia chimed in, scoffing that we were pathetic for trying to witness their private business affairs. They were desperately clinging to their false superiority, entirely blind to the trap closing around them. The sheer delusion required to maintain their arrogance in this specific moment was truly staggering to witness. I did not respond. I simply leaned back in my chair, keeping my eyes locked on my father, and waited for the inevitable revelation to crush his fragile ego into absolute dust. At the far end of the massive conference table, the oversized black leather executive chair was facing the floor-to-ceiling window, its high back completely concealing the person sitting in it. Throughout my family's entire frantic entrance and subsequent meltdown, the occupant had remained entirely motionless, staring out at the sprawling Manhattan skyline, ignoring their petty squabbles. Slowly, the leather chair began to swivel around. The smooth, mechanical glide of the chair was the only sound in the dead quiet room. Richard stopped laughing instantly. Patricia froze mid-sentence, her hand hovering awkwardly near her pearl necklace. Amanda stopped breathing entirely, her eyes widening in pure terror. Jamal shrank back into his seat, his hands gripping the leather armrests so tightly his knuckles cracked under the immense pressure. The chair turned completely, revealing the man sitting at the absolute pinnacle of the Wall Street food chain. Leo sat there perfectly relaxed, his broad shoulders filling out a breathtaking bespoke $10,000 Italian suit. The cheap faded t-shirts and beat-up sneakers were completely gone. This was Leo in his true element. The suit was a masterclass in aggressive wealth, cut from midnight navy wool, paired with a crisp white shirt and a perfectly knotted silk tie. The fabric draped flawlessly over his athletic frame, projecting an aura of raw, concentrated power. He looked exactly like a man who destroyed massive corporations before breakfast. He was not the quiet, unassuming man they had ruthlessly mocked at my wedding. He was the apex predator they had unknowingly provoked. The terrifying, faceless entity they had been begging for mercy all night was sitting right in front of them, breathing the same filtered air. Leo rested his elbows on the polished oak table, calmly steepling his fingers beneath his chin. His dark, calculating eyes locked onto my father. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He did not yell. He did not gloat. He simply delivered the final crushing blow with the effortless precision of a highly trained sniper. "Good morning, Richard. I believe you owe me $80 million. The silence that followed Leo's words was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the very oxygen out of the enormous boardroom. For a fraction of a second, the universe seemed to pause before the catastrophic reality crashed down upon them. Patricia was the first to physically break. She had been holding a crystal glass of sparkling water, her knuckles tight, her posture rigid. When the impossibility of my husband sitting in the CEO chair finally registered, her fingers gave out. The heavy crystal slipped from her manicured grasp and plummeted toward the polished hardwood floor. It shattered with a violent, piercing crash. Shards of expensive glass exploded across the black marble, splashing sparkling water over her designer shoes. She did not even blink. She just stared at Leo, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish, completely incapable of forming a single coherent syllable. Amanda let out a sharp, ragged gasp, stepping backward until her spine collided hard against the glass wall of the boardroom. The golden child who had spent the last decade treating Leo like a peasant looked as if she were staring into the eyes of a monster. Her hands flew to cover her mouth, her chest heaving as a full-blown panic attack began to seize her nervous system. She looked at me, then at Leo, the horrific calculation running through her eyes as she realized her luxurious lifestyle. Her promised Aspen vacation home and her entire social identity were being held hostage by the exact man she had ruthlessly mocked. Beside her, Jamal physically withered. The flashy stockbroker shrank down into his leather chair, practically folding in on himself. He was sweating profusely now. Heavy drops of perspiration rolled down his bruised jawline and soaked into the collar of his custom suit. He knew exactly what this meant. He knew the faceless entity who had seized their corporate debt was the man whose dignity he had tried to purchase for a crumpled $100 bill at my wedding reception. Jamal squeezed his eyes shut, his hands trembling violently on his lap, a man entirely consumed by the visceral terror of a federal prison sentence. My father, however, refused to accept his defeat. Richard's entire psychological foundation was built on absolute dominance. His mind simply rejected the image in front of him. He let out a harsh, strained laugh, shaking his head, as if trying to physically dislodge the hallucination. "Is this a joke?" Richard barked, his voice cracking with a desperate, pathetic defiance. He pointed a shaking finger at Leo. "You think you can rent a suit and play some sick prank on me? Did you bribe the assistant downstairs? Where is the real chief executive? I am not playing these games with a penniless data clerk. Bring me the man in charge right now." Richard slammed his hand on the oak table, desperately trying to reclaim his authority. He looked at me, his eyes blazing with furious contempt. "You set this up, Natalie. You set this up to humiliate me because you are a spiteful, jealous child. I am calling building security. I am having both of you arrested for corporate trespassing." Leo did not flinch. He simply watched my father unravel with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a trapped animal. He let Richard finish his pathetic tirade. Then Leo smoothly reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket. He pulled out a sleek silver pen and a thick sealed manila envelope. He broke the red security seal and pulled out a stack of heavy legal parchment. Leo tossed the documents across the expansive mahogany table. They slid perfectly across the polished wood, stopping exactly 1 inch from my father's trembling hands. I highly recommend you look at the second page before you call security. Richard. Leo instructed, his voice dropping to a smooth, lethal cadence. Because the real chief executive of Apex Holdings is sitting directly in front of you, and he holds the original copies of your felony wire fraud. Richard looked down at the documents. The remaining color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. Lying on the table was the original commercial bridge loan agreement. It was the exact paperwork Richard and Patricia had illegally executed to secure the shadow loan. On the signature line was the flawless forgery of my name. Right beside it was the corrupt corporate notary stamp linking the fraud directly back to Pierce Luxury Estates. "You forged your daughter's signature to steal a Manhattan property," Leo stated, leaning forward slightly, the predatory gleam in his dark eyes intensifying. "You crossed state lines to secure funds under entirely false pretenses. You engaged in a massive conspiracy to defraud a private lending institution. That is a federal felony, Richard. It carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. I own the debt, and I own the absolute proof of your criminal enterprise." The psychological breakdown of the toxic family was instantaneous and absolute. The crushing gravity of the situation finally breached Richard's ego. His legs gave out. He collapsed backward into his leather chair, his chest heaving as he stared at the forged signatures. He was a billionaire who had spent his life controlling everyone around him, now entirely at the mercy of the son-in-law he had ruthlessly humiliated. Patricia covered her face, letting out a wretched sob. The arrogant matriarch who had ripped the tiara from my head was now weeping openly, her freedom completely pulverized. Amanda slid down the glass wall, pulling her knees to her chest in a state of catatonic shock. Leo turned his gaze away from the broken billionaire and locked his dark, unforgiving eyes directly onto my brother-in-law. Jamal stiffened, his breathing shallow, fully recognizing the terrifying shift in Leo's attention. Leo leaned his forearms on the heavy oak table, clasping his hands together. The absolute silence in the penthouse boardroom was heavy, suffocating, and dripping with raw power. "You told me to call an Uber back to the slums, Jamal. Today I am calling the shots on your entire miserable lives." Jamal swallowed so hard it sounded like glass breaking in his throat. He sat completely paralyzed, pinned to his seat under Leo's relentless stare. He had no arrogant comebacks left. The realization that his fake Wall Street persona had just been obliterated by a true financial titan left him gasping for air. Leo broke eye contact with the disgraced broker and casually reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a secondary, significantly thicker file folder. He tossed it onto the table, letting it slide right on top of the forged loan documents resting in front of my father. "By the way, Richard," Leo said, his voice terrifyingly conversational, "before I officially take your company and strip it down for parts, you should probably know exactly why it failed in the first place." Richard stared at the new folder with extreme caution, treating it like a live explosive. His hands shook as he opened the cover. Inside was a complete, irrefutable forensic accounting report compiled by the Apex data team. It detailed every single transaction, every hidden wire transfer, and every offshore shell company Jamal had created to drain the Pierce family reserve fund. The records proved that Jamal had never invested a single dollar of the $150 million he was entrusted with. Instead, he had gambled it away on disastrous cryptocurrency bets and funneled the rest to cover his own catastrophic margin calls. Richard looked up from the documents. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal short-circuited his brain. He turned his head slowly, locking his bloodshot eyes onto his favorite son-in-law. The man he had praised while disowning me had systematically bled his entire corporate legacy completely dry. Amanda pushed herself off the glass wall. She snatched the financial summaries right out of her father's hands. The golden child stared at the zero balances. The reality that her husband had vaporized her limitless trust fund and her promised Aspen vacation home finally clicked. She let out an ear-piercing, blood-curdling scream. She lunged forward and slapped Jamal across the face with devastating force. The sharp crack echoed through the boardroom. Jamal cowered, bringing his hands up to protect his head, as Amanda shrieked that he had ruined her perfect life. Before Richard could even launch himself across the table to join the assault, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open once again. 4 individuals walked into the room wearing dark windbreakers, bearing the bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission. They bypassed my parents entirely and marched straight toward the cowering stockbroker. Jamal Washington, the lead federal agent, announced, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, severe corporate embezzlement, and federal tax evasion." Jamal collapsed to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. He pleaded for mercy, begging Richard to help him, as the agents secured his wrists and dragged him out of the room entirely. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, severing Jamal's desperate cries from the quiet boardroom. The silence that rushed back into the massive room was absolute and suffocating. Amanda remained slumped against the thick glass wall, staring vacantly at the empty space where her husband had just been standing. Her picture-perfect reality was completely annihilated in seconds. Richard and Patricia were left entirely defenseless. Their golden son-in-law was headed to federal prison, their massive reserve fund was wiped out, and the irrefutable evidence of their own felony forgery sat right in the center of the mahogany table. They had absolutely no leverage left. The sheer gravity of their impending doom finally broke through my mother's icy exterior. Patricia's knees physically gave out. She collapsed onto the polished black marble floor, her expensive designer dress pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She crawled across the room toward my chair, her face streaked with dark mascara and desperate tears. She aggressively grasped at the hem of my custom-tailored suit, sobbing uncontrollably. "Natalie, please!" Patricia begged, her voice high and frantic. "I am your mother. I gave you life. You cannot let them send us to a federal penitentiary. We will not survive it. I am begging you, please have mercy on your own flesh and blood." I looked down at the woman who had publicly ripped a diamond tiara from my head and joyfully banished me from her life. I felt absolutely nothing for her. I pulled my leg back forcefully, making her release my suit. I told her that she officially stopped being my mother the exact moment she decided my grandfather's inheritance was just disposable collateral for her own selfish greed. Richard watched his wife weeping on the floor, the last remaining fragments of his untouchable billionaire pride completely shattered. His broad shoulders slumped, and the defiant, arrogant fire in his eyes permanently extinguished. He was left with only the hollow, terrified gaze of a truly defeated man. He slowly turned his head to face me. He did not look at Leo anymore. He knew exactly who was holding the executioner's axe in this room. "What do you want?" Natalie, Richard asked, his voice breaking into barely a whisper. "Tell me exactly what it will take to make this go away right now." I did not hesitate for a single second. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a single neatly bound legal document. I slid the new contract directly across the long table. It stopped right in front of his trembling hands. I looked at him, feeling a deep sense of absolute closure as I delivered the final, non-negotiable terms of his surrender. I waited for him to read it, ensuring he understood his total defeat completely before speaking again. "Sign over 100% of Pierce Estates to Apex. You walk away with nothing, but Leo won't hand the forgery evidence to the FBI. That is your severance package." Defeated Richard signs the paper. The scratch of the pen against the thick parchment echoed like a final gavel strike in the silent boardroom. Richard's hand shook violently as he completed his signature, effectively signing away his entire life's work. He dropped the silver pen. It clattered against the mahogany table, a pathetic sound that marked the absolute end of the Pierce family dynasty. Leo immediately stepped forward, collecting the newly signed documents and sliding them into a sleek black leather portfolio. He did not gloat or offer any parting words of wisdom. He simply handed the portfolio to his lead corporate attorney and ordered the restructuring team to finalize the immediate transfer of all corporate assets. My parents and my sister were escorted out of the Apex Holdings skyscraper by armed security. They walked out into the sweltering Manhattan heat with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs. There were no luxury town cars waiting for them at the curb. Their corporate accounts were seized, their personal assets were frozen solid, and their credit lines were completely decimated. They had to walk several blocks to a public transit station, a humiliating reality check that was only the very beginning of their brutal descent into the life they had always mocked. The fallout over the next 6 months was methodical, absolute, and thoroughly satisfying. The federal authorities did not need my parents' forged documents to completely dismantle my brother-in-law. The sheer mountain of evidence regarding his offshore embezzlement wire fraud and illegal margin trades was more than enough to secure a catastrophic conviction. Jamal's high-priced defense attorneys vanished the moment his funds dried up. He was assigned a notoriously overworked public defender and stood before a federal judge looking like a completely broken man. He wept openly in the courtroom as he was sentenced to 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The arrogant stockbroker who had thrown a $100 bill at my husband was now wearing a bright orange jumpsuit completely stripped of his fake Wall Street persona. Amanda's golden child status evaporated the exact second the money disappeared. With Jamal locked away and my parents completely bankrupted, her lavish allowance was permanently terminated. The bank foreclosed on her sprawling suburban estate, repossessing her designer wardrobe, her luxury vehicles, and every single piece of expensive jewelry she owned. The woman who had thrown a screaming tantrum in my living room over a lost Aspen vacation home was brutally forced into a harsh new reality. Amanda had to move into a tiny, dilapidated studio apartment on the far edge of the city. Because she had never worked a legitimate day in her entire life, she possessed absolutely zero marketable skills. She was forced to take a minimum wage job as a retail clerk at a discount department store. She now spends her days folding clearance sweaters and ringing up customers completely exhausted and entirely invisible to the high society circles she used to dominate. My parents faced a similarly devastating reality. The total liquidation of Pierce luxury estates meant their sprawling multi-million-dollar mansion was seized by creditors. They were formally evicted, forced to watch as moving companies hauled away their antique furniture, their expensive art collections, and their imported vehicles. Because they were left with absolutely zero equity and massive outstanding civil liabilities from their defaulted shadow loans, they could not afford to live anywhere near their former elite neighborhoods. In a twist of absolute poetic justice, Richard and Patricia were forced to relocate to a tiny rundown apartment building on the exact same street they had previously visited to mock Leo and me. They were now permanent residents of the very same slums they had so viciously despised. My mother, who had once ripped a diamond tiara from my head, now spends her mornings clipping grocery coupons and arguing with her landlord about the broken heating system. My father, the once terrifying corporate titan, sits on a cheap plastic lawn chair on his cramped balcony, staring blankly at the traffic below. They are entirely cut off from the country club elites who immediately abandoned them the second their wealth vanished. They have no empire, no legacy, and absolutely no power. I did not waste a single moment feeling sorry for them. I was too busy building an empire of my own. I officially absorbed the remaining healthy assets of Pierce Estates and merged them directly with my thriving public relations consultancy. I completely rebranded the entire operation under my own name, launching a massive, highly successful firm that specializes in corporate crisis management and premium real estate development. The toxic, abusive culture my father had fostered for decades was instantly eradicated. I filled my executive boardroom with talented, fiercely loyal professionals who valued integrity over blind ambition. My business skyrocketed, securing massive contracts across the globe and solidifying my position as one of the most respected female executives in the industry today. Despite his unimaginable wealth and terrifying corporate power, Leo never changed who he fundamentally was. Once the hostile takeover was fully complete, he happily went right back to wearing his comfortable faded cotton t-shirts and his worn-out sneakers. He still drives his old car on the weekends, completely unbothered by the superficial expectations of elite society. Our home is not filled with cold museum-quality artifacts or pretentious staff. It is filled with warmth, genuine laughter, and absolute trust. He is the brilliant, ruthless architect of my family's downfall, but to me he is just the incredible man I love with my entire heart. We built our lives on a foundation of mutual respect and unyielding support, proving that true wealth is not measured by the numbers in a bank account, but by the strength of the person standing beside you when the world tries to break you down. Family isn't an excuse for abuse. When people show you who they really are, believe them the first time, and then make sure you own the bank they owe money to. Have you ever had a family member drastically underestimate you? Share your story in the comments below. The story of Natalie and Leo serves as a powerful reminder that true worth is never defined by the conditional approval of toxic people. For years, Natalie operated under the crushing weight of her family expectations, believing that loyalty required her to endure endless humiliation. Her father weaponized his wealth, demanding absolute submission, while her mother and sister equated human value with superficial status. They viewed her independence as a threat, and her unassuming husband as a joke. However, the profound lesson embedded in this narrative is that authentic power does not roar, it observes. Leo did not need a designer suit or a flashy car to prove his capability. He possessed the quiet, unshakable confidence of someone who had built a genuine empire. Conversely, the loud, aggressive arrogance was merely a fragile mask, hiding deep insecurity and corruption. When crisis struck, the superficial foundation collapsed instantly, revealing cowardice and greed. The journey illustrates the absolute necessity of establishing firm boundaries. Walking away from blood relatives is often viewed as a taboo, but when family members resort to exploitation and felony fraud to protect their own egos, walking away becomes an act of essential personal preservation. Natalie did not seek revenge through petty retaliation. She achieved justice by removing her emotional availability and allowing their own corrupt choices to orchestrate their downfall. We must learn to evaluate people by their actions in our darkest moments, rather than their social standing. Wealth can evaporate overnight, but integrity remains. You must never allow toxic individuals to dictate your reality, even if they share your last name. Always choose to protect your personal inner peace over saving a highly abusive relationship. Take a moment today to evaluate your own relationships and set firm boundaries with anyone who fails to respect your true worth.